In 1952, 64-year-old gamekeeper and handyman George Henry Harry Peach, who was also a World War I veteran, and his 67-year-old wife Lillian lived in the sleepy village of Ashton in Northamptonshire, England, in a quaint thatched cottage known as West Lodge, situated on the Ashton Wold estate on the outskirts of the village. The couple had lived in the Ashton countryside for around 6 years by this time, having previously resided in Fotheringhay. Ashton was home to a mere 32 people in 1952, a tight-knit community who all got on well with George and Lillian Peach. According to one source, they were seen by villagers as, quote, the happiest couple in the world. They had been married for a number of years and shared a son together. George had suffered a leg wound during his time fighting in the war, but other than that, both he and his wife were in good health and happy by all accounts. On Friday, the 24th of October 1952, George spent the day working on the estate as usual before collecting his wages at the end of his shift, a total of £9, 13 shillings and a sixpence. He was then seen heading home by a fellow employee along a quiet lane. His wife Lillian was seen hanging out clothes at around 5 p.m. that same evening. Neither of them were seen alive again. The following day, on Saturday the 25th of October, the butcher's roundsman, Lawrence Wright, stopped by West Lodge to deliver some meat for the couple's usual Sunday roast. However, after knocking on the front and back doors of the cottage, nobody answered. Afterwards, Lawrence headed to the Three Horseshoes pub nearby and gave the meat to the proprietor, Frank Slater, who told the roundsman that George had also failed to show up for work that morning. This was very unusual and out of character for George, who was a hard-working individual. Frank took the meat and attempted to redeliver it to West Lodge that afternoon, but once again nobody answered the door. Curious, Frank visited the main office at Chapel Farm, on the estate where the Peaches cottage was located. He asked the manager there if George had been in touch, but he had not, and nothing indicated that he was off ill. Frank and the secretary went to West Lodge looking for George, but what they found within the home chilled them to the bone. Upon arrival, the pair found the front door of the Peaches cottage unlocked, which was common practice in the normally safe village. Upon searching through the house, Frank and the secretary found Lillian unconscious in the upstairs bedroom, lying on the bed covered in blood, having been struck with a hammer of some kind a number of times. Lillian also had several defensive wounds on her hands and arms, clearly having fought her attacker with all of her might. Following the discovery, Frank went back to Chapel Farm, where he swiftly contacted the police. Upon closer inspection, the second bedroom at the rear of the property appeared to have been locked shut, and the key could not be found. Frank, the secretary, and the estate chauffeur who returned to help aid in the situation managed to break the door down, and inside the room lay George Peach, he too unconscious on his bed, drenched in blood. He had suffered heavy blows to his neck and head, likely with a hammer, and these blows fractured his skull. By the time he was discovered, George clearly had been deceased for some time, at least 12 hours. The couple had more than likely been attacked in their sleep. Lillian was transferred to Peterborough Hospital barely alive, and unfortunately she passed away later that night. Both bodies were formally identified by their son Jack, who had last been visited by his parents 2 months prior to their deaths at his home in Staines. Upon Northamptonshire police arriving at the scene, they searched for any clues in the vicinity, such as the nearby woods, but found nothing. Back at the cottage, investigators looked for any sign of forced entry and soon discovered that the pantry window at the rear of the house was open and one of the lead panes were missing, police concluding that the perpetrator had entered the cottage through this particular window. They also found fingerprints by the window pane and on the bedroom door handles, but despite taking over 1,000 prints from locals, no match was found. Interestingly to note, nothing appeared to have been disturbed within the cottage, though it was later determined that George's watch and wages were missing, as was the money from Lillian's handbag. Her purse was also missing. It was common knowledge, however, that the Peaches kept all of their cash at home. What struck investigators as odd was, of course, why the perpetrator entered through the pantry window when the front door was unlocked, police concluding that the killer exited the property this way. Also, the fact that both bedroom doors had been locked by the perpetrator following the crime. Firstly, where did they find the keys, and why did they lock George and Lillian in their rooms? Was it to delay the bodies being discovered? The Ashton villagers were left shocked by the murders and could not understand why anyone would have hurt such a lovely couple. There was only one single-track road through the village, and nobody witnessed anything out of the ordinary in the days leading up to the discovery of George and Lillian's bodies. Due to the very strange nature of the crime, local police teamed up with Scotland Yard detectives from London in order to find out what happened to George and Lillian. Over the course of the investigation, over 5,000 people were questioned and several leads were followed, including reports of suspicious activity at Peterborough railway station and reports of a woman flagging down lorry drivers in the area at the time of the murders. But unfortunately, these potential leads went nowhere. Others suggested that George and Lillian were perhaps victims of mistaken identity, as a wealthy couple lived nearby. An extensive search was conducted in order to find the murder weapon, and this proved to be far more difficult than first thought. It wasn't until 6 days after the murders that a woman at Chapel Farm contacted police and told them that she had found a blood-stained coal hammer in a cabbage patch in her garden, located approximately 500 metres away from West Lodge, where the Peaches lived. Police collected the hammer and concluded that it was most likely the weapon used to bludgeon George and Lillian Peach. 2 weeks after this discovery, another break came in the case. A police officer discovered a small purse on the roadside banking leading out of Ashton, just by the farm manager's garden wall, less than 100 metres away from where the hammer had been found in the cabbage patch. It was later confirmed by police that the purse had belonged to Lillian and that the hammer had also belonged to the Peach family. It had been absent from their coal bunker where it was usually kept. Both areas where the hammer and purse were found were scoured by police during initial investigations, and they were not recovered at that time. This made police believe that the items were dumped after the initial searches were conducted, meaning that the perpetrator most likely was local and didn't make an effort to leave the area to dispose of the evidence. Police tried to narrow down potential suspects, but with next to no evidence, this proved difficult. Locals were very cooperative with police, but at the same time, they grew suspicious of one another. Despite extensive investigations, the case went cold. That was until 1956, when an anonymous phone call was made to police. The caller claimed that a man who worked at a fairground in Tottenham knew important information about a murder in Northamptonshire in 1952. Fingerprints were taken from a number of men who worked at the fairground, with nobody refusing to have their fingerprints taken, but once again no match was found to the prints found on the Peach's window pane. One of these fairs were actually located near Ashton at the time of the murders. What we do know is that the perpetrator must have known the Ashton area well, and possibly knew George and Lillian personally. They knew that George and the rest of the estate workers had just been paid their wages, therefore saw an opportunity for robbery. Even if this was the case, why did the perpetrator then go on to murder the couple in cold blood, all for the sake of less than £10? Many struggle to find a motive in this case other than robbery, though someone from George's past could have perhaps been involved, maybe from his army days. Another theory is that someone who was angry about poaching, a hugely controversial issue at the time, could have committed the crime, especially since George was the local gamekeeper. What truly happened to George and Lillian and why remains a mystery. The couple were buried in Fotheringhay Church graveyard on the 7th of November, following a service which was attended by hundreds of mourners. Their killer has never been caught, and justice has never been served. We can only hope that through advances of DNA technology that this case will one day finally be solved.